We live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, yet here in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal people are dying earlier, locked up at unprecedented rates, living in overcrowded homes and being denied the education and health opportunities that non-Aboriginal Territorians take for granted. And that's why we have Closing the Gap Day, not as a report, not as a target list, but as a commitment to justice, equality and human dignity. When I first heard about Closing the Gap in 2007, I never imagined that 19 years later I'd be standing in this parliament talking about it and that we would have gone backwards, not forwards. Closing the Gap was established as a commitment to equality and a promise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would have the same opportunities for health, education, housing and justice as the rest of Australia. And Madam Speaker, I am not interested in the ongoing time wasting in this chamber of assigning blame. I can't believe that people are using this opportunity to talk about this great tragedy that is facing this country and this opportunity to do something about it, to attack each other instead of getting on with what we all agree is a huge issue, particularly here in the Territory. I agree with the member for Fonglim that the time for tantrums in this chamber is over. I don't care about you all shouting at each other. I care about the fact that 1/3 of our population, Aboriginal Territorians, have dramatically worse outcomes in health, in justice, in education and housing than non-Aboriginal Territorians, and we are not doing enough about it. We've already heard in this chamber that as of today, the latest data is out and stark, that the Northern Territory has the worst progress in Australia on closing the gap targets. We've gone backwards in 7 key areas. The areas we're deteriorating and include adult and youth imprisonment, child development, early childhood education and life expectancy. And these aren't numbers, they're people, their families, their communities whose daily lives are shaped by entrenched disadvantage. In the words of Donna Archie, the CEO of APONT now, this data reflects the systemic disadvantage that Aboriginal Territorians face. Madam Speaker, we are widening the gap, not closing it. And as the jurisdiction with the highest proportion of Aboriginal Territorians, this is completely unacceptable. So let's talk about this gap. Why does it exist? Why does it persist? And why is it widening here in the Northern Territory? Our government must stop pursuing policies that worsen inequality. I heard the member for Fonglim also say that the CLP government is doing the work to address this. So let's look at what this government has done. In the words of Nerida White, the acting chair of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services, she highlights that laws that refuse to raise the age of criminal responsibility, or in fact lower it, as we have done here, impose harsher bail conditions and push adult crime, adult time policies, all drive up incarceration rates, entrenching trauma and damage and harm to Aboriginal people. So when the CLP insists on passing draconian tough-on-crime laws against all evidence and despite the clear disproportionate effect they will have on Aboriginal Australians, they are entrenching trauma, entrenching disadvantage and widening the gap. When they shut down community control, make policy decisions for Aboriginal communities without consultation and write consultation out of laws, they are entrenching harm, they're entrenching disadvantage and they're widening the gap. When they abuse urgency powers to shut down scrutiny and pass legislation that directly impacts on and harms Aboriginal people, they are entrenching trauma and disadvantage and widening the gap. When the government pursues evictions and punishment for public housing tenants, the vast majority of whom are Aboriginal, doxes addresses of vulnerable people and uses rhetoric like, which we heard in the chamber today, housing is a privilege, not a right, they fundamentally misunderstand the role housing plays as a foundation for an equal and healthy society. And when the CLP refused to support calls for Commonwealth oversight into the ongoing crisis of Indigenous deaths in custody, despite Aboriginal people being 5 times more likely to die in prison, they are contributing to widening the gap. When they scrap plans for a review into racism within the NT police force, while the NT continues to lock up Aboriginal people at the highest rate in the country, they are widening the gap. Madam Speaker, this is the consequence of this legislative agenda. The Closing the Gap agreement was never meant to be a tick box exercise for governments reduced to an annual report or a list of completed actions. It was never meant to be, as the member for Fonglim said, one day a year when we are tired old one day of the year, when we come back into wherever it is that we might talk about things and say, oh, here we are again. It was meant to be a commitment to real structural change, change that should transform the day-to-day lives of Aboriginal people and communities in the Territory. Madam Speaker, I've raised before in this chamber that we get here in the Northern Territory, the GST needs-based funding we receive from the federal government is 5 times the funding per capita than most other jurisdictions. And I note that we will be getting a bit of a bonus in our GST payments this year, so it'll be interesting to see how the government chooses to spend that. We get that because there is a recognition of the acute need and high cost of delivering services in the NT. And we get that because this funding is meant to address inequality in access to services, including health services, but it isn't going where it needs to. And we can see that clearly when our Closing the Gap targets are going backwards. We can't see it clearly when we ask for data about how that GST money is spent, because we're told that's not tracked. But if we look at the data and the outcomes, that gives us very clear information. Madam Speaker, if we want health inequality to get better in the Northern Territory, we have to invest in healthcare. And if we want housing inequality to get better, we have to invest in housing. Madam Speaker, the data, there's so much data. The new data came out today, as we heard. We heard that less than half, in the NT, less than half the national average of children are developmentally on track, that 87% of homeless Territorians are Aboriginal. More than half of remote community homes are overcrowded in severely overcrowded dwellings. In the words of the CEO of AHNT, Leanne Caton, housing is not just a roof over one's head, it's a determinant of life itself, a cultural anchor, a place for ceremony, language and kinship. Critically, without good living conditions and fundamentals like access to water, the ability to wash and a safe house, improving health is impossible. When housing policy ignores these dimensions, it perpetuates harm. And we've already heard in this chamber our prison statistics. We have, per capita, the most Indigenous people locked up in the world. On many given days, 100% of young people locked up here in the Territory are Aboriginal. Madam Speaker, these are dramatically worse outcomes than anywhere else in Australia, and they are not accidents. They are the product of systemic and structural racism. Let me talk about structural racism for a minute, because I know it's a difficult term for some people in this chamber. I note that I was told in estimates it was a term that I cannot use for reasons that I still don't understand. Madam Speaker, structural racism is not about individual prejudice. It's not about telling people they're racist. It's about the systems, the policies and the institutions that produce these dramatically worse outcomes, even if no one sets out to cause harm. I'm sure there is no one in this chamber that believes that what is happening here in the Territory at the moment for Aboriginal people is okay. We can see it clearly in health, in education, in housing and in justice systems where Aboriginal people are consistently disadvantaged. We can see it, it's completely visible in the statistics and the lived reality of communities. And Madam Speaker, if we can't talk about it, how can we address it? So, as I said, I'm sure no one in this chamber wants to see these terrible statistics, and I look forward to hearing other members talk about this in this chamber this evening. Madam Speaker, there's something terribly wrong when we live in a country with so much wealth, yet Aboriginal people are dying, locked up, homeless and harmed at a rate so out of proportion with the rest of Australia and with non-Aboriginal people, and we must be doing every single thing we can to change this. As I said, closing the gap is not a theoretical exercise. We shouldn't be rolling our eyes and saying, here we are again. It's a national commitment. It's about justice, equality and human rights. It's about listening to community voices, following their lead and embedding self-determination into decision-making, just as we heard so clearly from the member for Mallorca earlier today. Madam Speaker, if we are serious about closing the gap, we must follow the voices of our communities and invest in the services they need, protect their rights and dismantle the systems that so clearly produce inequality. Closing the gap was never meant to be partisan. It was never meant to be an opportunity for political parties to take potshots at each other. It's a national commitment. It requires governments, communities and leaders to work together. It's about the basic human rights of Aboriginal Territorians and Aboriginal people across Australia. Madam Speaker, I agree, and it's been said in this chamber before, the people of the Northern Territory don't need more reports. Aboriginal people don't need more meetings. They don't need more talk. They need action that improves lives today and every day after that. Children, families, elders, they deserve our best and they deserve it now. Madam Speaker, this gap will not close itself, and right now we are not even closing it, we are making it wider. We must act urgently, work together and stop widening disadvantage, because the time for talk is over and the time for action is now. Thank you, Madam Speaker.